Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. So, I don't think I've technically ever made one of these videos. Looking through my channel, I don't think I have any sort of like my favorite all-time book videos, so it's about time that I make one of these. This is basically going to be when that one person who just doesn't understand asks you, hey, what's your favorite book of all time? And your brain just like short circuits. This is going to be kind of what that answer would be, because we all know you don't have one favorite book. Like, that's an impossible feat to accomplish, is naming one title. But these are going to be 10 books that come to mind immediately when somebody asks me that question. And I also feel like I should preface this by saying I'm not including like all-time, in my opinion, understood favorites. Like, I don't have Harry Potter on here because it's 2019. Everybody knows that everybody loves Harry Potter. Like, I feel like that's fairly understood. So just keep in the back of mind, like, Harry Potter, Name of the Wind, I don't have on this list, but probably should be on this list. Lord of the Rings, just in my opinion, like, all around, like, classic books that I feel like everybody has read at this point that should just be assumed that are on your favorites. I don't have these in any particular order whatsoever. Like, I don't have them ranked 1 through 10. I don't have a favorite book. These are all just books that I have revisited over and over and over again and still love with my whole heart and will always recommend to people, will always be able to talk about with people. So I'm just gonna get started. There's no rhyme or reason to the order of this video, just know that going in. I have 2 books on this list that I don't actually know where my physical copies are, which makes me very distraught. The first book on this list might be surprising to you guys because I don't talk about it very often on my channel anymore, is The Child Thief by Bram. This, I feel like, started my love of dark high fantasy. This is a very, very dark Peter Pan retelling that's set in a high fantasy setting, is pretty messed up, and truly started my love of high fantasy when I was way too young to be reading stories like this. And I have reread it over the years and it holds up and it's amazing. I just adore Bram as an author, as an illustrator. This is a classic story that I will always be able to revisit and recommend to a lot of people. I feel like this is a very well received book if you like fantasy and dark stuff. And the other book that I don't physically have on me, as in it's somewhere in the stacks and stacks of books in storage right now, is my very well-loved copy of The Black Stallion by Walter Farley. You all know by now that I'm a horse person. I've had horses, I've ridden horses pretty much my entire life. I'm an equestrian at heart, and this book single-handedly started that. I read endless horse books as a child, but The Black Stallion is a book that I have reread thousands of times. Like, I want to be Alec so badly. I want to live on a remote island with a horse and ride it down the beach 24/7. Like, this is an ideal lifestyle for me. Not really, I like plumbing. But this is a book that I will just always keep in the back of my head as what started my love of horses, what started my love of reading about horses, and it's just a truly loved book in my life. Getting into books that I can actually line up on the cart right now, this one is gonna come as no surprise to you guys. ACOMAF. This is obviously book 2 in the ACOTAR series, A Court of Thorns and Roses, if you guys have been living under a rock. In my opinion, the story starts in this book and ends in this book. I have reread this book probably more than any book I have on my shelf. It's just a comfort read for me. When I'm in a slump, I can read this. When I'm not in a slump, I can read this. Like, I can always pick this up. I can literally look at like fan art of ACOMAF and be like, well, it's time to pick that book up for 100th time. I know these books can be problematic. I know these books have been torn apart over the years. It's still one of my favorite series though. I will always be able to read this book and love this book. Another book that I can revisit year after year after year and still relate so incredibly hard to this book is Fangirl by Rainbow Rowell. I know this makes a lot of people's lists just because this was one of the first well-written contemporary stories that came out about a very introverted, socially anxious person. It's clearly about a girl who fangirls over stuff. It's just incredibly relatable to a lot of us in the book community just because she doesn't do well with crowds of people. She doesn't do well in group settings, and she really just wants to sit alone and read fan fiction about her favorite books. But there are just so many lines in this book that just resonate with me. Even as like a 29-year-old adult woman, I can still relate to Kath so hard in this book. Just, there's so many sentences that are just like, wow, that was me in a sentence. So this is a book that I can go back to and reread and love just as much every single time I pick it up. Another one of my all-time favorite books that I revisited this year and I was nervous about rereading because I had it on such a pedestal from the year before is The Poppy War by R.F. Kuang. This is definitely not going to be a book for everybody, and I always kind of gauge the person that I'm recommending it to before I actually recommend it to them, because this is a very heavy, dark, disturbing fantasy that is based on Chinese history that gets gruesome. but it's written so well. Like, this book has like everything that I want in a fantasy setting. Like, it kind of has like a magical school setting, like a training setting. And within this one book, it expands from like an isolated training setting to the bigger world, to the bigger world, to the bigger world. Like, it just gives you like the whole scope of what I love about fantasy books. And I just adored it. Rin is one of my favorite protagonists that I've ever read about because she's definitely morally gray, and that's something that I really like in books. She definitely toes the line of being good versus evil, and she steps over it quite a few times, and I really like reading about characters like that. So this was one of the best books that I've ever picked up, and since revisiting it this year, I can still say that it still remains on my favorites list. The next books that are on this list are kind of just a trilogy. It's expanded beyond this, but I personally adore the Red Rising series by Pierce Brown. In my opinion, this is sci-fi meets fantasy. It's definitely sci-fi because it's set in like a space setting, but it reads more like a high fantasy. And this was one of my first introductions to just like really dark warfare in books, and I adored it. And again, if this was combined into one book, this kind of has the same world scope that the Poppy War does, where we start in kind of a young training setting, and it expands and expands and expands as the series goes on. This goes beyond this. We do have Iron Gold and Dark Age at this point, but these three books I can go back and reread and just binge all the way through and be emotionally traumatized the entire time and love it. Like, I don't know why I abuse myself like I do, but I just love this series so much. There's so much like emotional growth and trauma and drama and intrigue, and it's all of the things that I generally don't look for in books, but I love how it was portrayed in this. Like, I'm not huge into political warfare in books, but this one is just, it's so good. I love it so much. Taking a turn from heavier books, I'm gonna go back to some contemporary. The Simple Wild by K.A. Tucker is easily my most recommended and my most loved romance at this point, and it's so much more than a romance story. I just adore everything about this book. All of the tropes that are in this book are like my favorite things to read about that can't be overdone in my mind. It's basically like a big city girl who gets taken out of her comfort zone and put into a rural setting and finds love of not only a romantic partner, but the people and the town that she gets transplanted into, and I just adore it so much. This follows a young woman who basically gets transplanted into the Alaskan wilds and kind of has to learn how to fend for herself there, learn how to take care of herself, but also learn how to take care of her family, and it's a very good found family in this book, and I adore it so much. I can read this so many times and love it just as much. I cry every time I read this book. I think by now I should be prepared for it, but I'm not. So I love this book so much. Another book that I revisited recently that definitely has to sit at the top of my favorites list is The Scorpio Races by Maggie Stiefvater. I have adored Maggie Stiefvater basically since the beginning of her books, but this one will forever remain my favorite by her, mainly because I am a horse person. Like, I can relate to so many things in this book, and I just appreciate that Maggie Stiefvater is a horse person and wrote everything accurately in a fantasy setting about horses. It's basically about this little island town that has these really demonic horses that come out of the sea every year that people capture and train and race, and it's so good. I just adore everything about this book. Every time I revisit it, I'm just so sucked into the world, and I love the characters. I love the horses that are in it. It's just so great. Okay, the next book that I just adore is, again, kind of a series. It's a duology plus a novella, and that is the Grip series by Kennedy Ryan. This is adult contemporary romance, but Kennedy Ryan, as you guys know, if you've been watching my channel recently, has become one of my favorite authors of all time because she writes a really good romance, but she packs so much into her books that is more than a romance. She packs so many modern societal issues and tackles them in a lovely setting. Like, she's not afraid to kind of like pull the curtain back and really deep dive into some serious issues that you generally don't see in contemporary romance, which I love. I love that it adds an extra layer to the story. But these books, I always pitch to people that Grip is kind of like an adult version of On the Come Up or The Hate You Give. It's very much a racially driven story where it really deep dives into the discussion about racism and about profiling and prejudice and all of the controversies that surround that, but it also ties it up with a nice little bow of romance. This is such an important story, in my opinion, and I feel like not enough people have picked it up, but if you guys liked the conversation that Angie Thomas opens up in her YA books, this is like the adult version of it. I just adore it so much. The romance is so swoony, but also the discussions that we have are so vitally important to have. So I love this series and I will forever recommend it to people. It's so dang good. And this last trilogy is a trilogy that I haven't talked about too recently on my channel. When I first started my channel, I was like deep into this. So I'm gonna bring it back up just in case you guys didn't know that I love this series. That is the Magician series by Lev Grossman. This is very much a polarizing series. I know many people that I've recommended it to absolutely hated it. Like, read the first book, DNF'd it, or read the first book, will not continue on with the series. But half the people I've recommended to just devour it like I did. So this is definitely hit or miss for you. Obviously, the first book is The Magicians, and then we have the two follow-ups, The Magician King and The Magician's Land. Like I said, all of the things that I like in fantasy, it's similar to the Happy War, where it takes place in kind of a magical school setting, but it's definitely not Hogwarts. This book kind of talks about being like an adult version of Harry Potter. It is not. It is so much darker than Harry Potter. Like, I would not recommend this to Harry Potter fans. But the only similarity is the fact that we basically are following magical schools and magical lands. Like, it kind of takes the elements that we get from like a Narnia type of book or Hogwarts, Harry Potter type of setting, and it really explores portal fantasy, but in a very, very dark way. And I just adore it. This basically follows a group of characters who end up kind of unlocking a portal into Fillory, which is like this story's version of Narnia. Like, it's a portal to a fantasy world. And it's not fluffy. Like, it gets very, very dark, and the magic system in this is so complex and so intense, and I just adore it. Also, our main characters in this book, we follow Quentin, who is our protagonist, but we also follow a cast of characters with him. Like, there's a core group of friends. They're all unlikable characters, which is not everybody's cup of tea. And I will be the first person to admit that to you guys. He is an asshole in this book. But if you guys are okay with morally gray characters, oh, this series is so good. I flew through this in like a week, like the entire trilogy, and I've reread it since. It's just as amazing. But these are all books and series that when asked what my favorite book is, these all come to mind. Plus The Child Thief and The Black Stallion. Don't forget about those. Those were the first two that I talked about. And I think I'm gonna make an updated list every year because while these will all most likely remain on the list, I'm sure as I age, as I read more, a lot more will be added to this list. So I think I'm gonna try and do this at the end of every year. 2020 Chelsea is probably looking back on this video and laughing. But as of right now, this is 29-year-old Chelsea coming at you with my top 10 titles that I will always recommend and I will always talk your ear off about and be able to fangirl with you about any of these books. So that's gonna be it for this video. I hope you guys enjoyed it, and I'll see you guys in my next one.